It's a great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Adam Hradilek, who is head of the Oral History Group at the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes in Prague. He is editor of the book For Your Freedom and Ours, a collection of memoirs and essays on protests against the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. And since 2011, he has also worked for the Czech Project at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington as a coordinator, translator, and interviewer of Holocaust witnesses. His current interest is Czechoslovak prisoners in Soviet labor camps, and he's writing about the fate of thousands of Czechoslovak Jews who escaped to the Soviet Union during World War II and who were imprisoned in the Gulag. Since 2008, Hradilek's Oral History Group has collected over 40 interviews with direct survivors of Soviet labor camp and collected their personal archives, which include thousands of documents, written memories, letters from the Gulag, and photographs. The group has searched the archives of the Czech Republic, Ukraine, the United States, and Israel, and collected over 100 memoiristic documents of Gulag survivors of Czech or Czechoslovak descent. His group has also prepared an exhibition concerning Czechoslovak citizens in Soviet labor camps. It was presented at the Václav Havel Library in Prague and received a lot of acclaim and is now traveling around the Czech Republic. The title of his talk today is Czechoslovak Jewish Refugees from Nazism and in the Gulag.
I just first wanted to express my gratitude to Michael Dade Fox and the other organizers of this event for the possibility to present my work and work of my colleagues back in Prague who are not able to be here, but I'm speaking also for them. First of all, I would like to put the project into a broader context of the work of our oral history group. It was already mentioned by Michael that we are focused on other important witnesses of modern Czechoslovak history since 2008 when our institute was established, and I took the chance of being the chief of the oral history group. As it was mentioned before, one of our major projects was trying to find members of protest against the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 in the countries that took part in the occupation. And we put up a book together with, and it's just being translated by Memorial organization in Moscow. Since 2008, we also started occasionally to collect testimonies of Czechoslovak victims of Gulag camps. But just last year, it became like our central issue, and we have already published a book which went out 3 weeks ago. It's a Czech-Russian version published together with Simon Vilensky's institution, Vazrashchenie in Moscow. It just came out, and I have like 10 copies with me, so whoever is interested, I'm ready to share it with you. As it was already mentioned by Michael, we have collected around 40 interviews with survivors in several countries and managed to collect also a lot of materials from family archives in these countries. And a very important source of our knowledge are interviews already done, like from 60s or 70s, and became part of our collection and are now being processed by us. Apart from this, we are trying to find materials connected to the people we interviewed or collected their memoirs in former NKVD archives. And we were pretty successful. We managed to find like most materials connected to the people we interviewed. Apart from collecting testimonies of the Czechoslovak victims, we also interviewed or collected interviews with several other people connected to Czechoslovakia. For example, we interviewed a year ago Pierre Dex. He was the guy that David Rousset put on trial in 1951. And it brought large attention to the Gulag issue. And there was also one Czech survivor of Gulag present at this trial. So we also interviewed, for example, Pierre Dex. Now I would like to focus on the major topic that we are now dealing with, and that's the memory of Czechoslovak Jews or Jewish refugees from Nazism in the Gulag. As you can see on the map, the only way on land to leave occupied Czechoslovakia or the protectorate of Beben and Maren was through Poland for a certain period of time before the occupation. So several thousands of Jews escaped to Poland and settled either in Krakow and later in Lviv. That's the one group of refugees. Second large group of Czechoslovak Jews who experienced the Gulag camps during the war were those that were taken by the first transports during the war to Nisko camp just on the border between German-occupied Poland and Poland occupied by Soviet Union in Nisko. And the third part are the Jews from the easternmost part of pre-war Czechoslovakia, so-called Karpato-Ruthenia or Ruthenia, just to make it shorter. I would like to, just for the example of the first case, because he's kind of typical, he has typical story of the person who escaped to Poland. His name was Robert Silton, a chemical engineer in Brno, where he lived with his wife and 3 children. And he fled the Nazi persecution to Poland in summer '39. And he first stayed in Katowice, but due to the German attack on Poland, he was forced to move to Soviet-occupied Lviv. But then he tried to cross the Soviet-Romanian border illegally in December '39, as he learned his family might be in Romania. But he was arrested and imprisoned in Stanislavov, and in July '40, he was sentenced to 5 years at the Sevžardolák camp in Koma Republic. And he took part in building the railroad from Kotlas to Vorkuta. He was released from the camp in 1944 in order to join the Czechoslovak unit in Soviet Union. It's just to make the story full, his whole family was killed by the Nazis during the war, and there is during our exhibition at the Václav Havel Library, we were approached by one documentarist who made by a chance a documentary about the daughter of Robert Silton, Ingeborg, which was transported to Ereda camp in Estonia, and one of the SS officers, Heinz Drozin, fell in love with her. They both escaped, and they either committed suicide or were killed during the escape and brought back to the camp after several days. And Robert Silton later, he survived the battles and moved to Israel. The oldest person we interviewed 2 years ago was Egon Morgenstern. He tried to escape through Poland to Sweden in 1939, but was arrested on the way in Vilnius, Lithuania, and sentenced to 5 years of labor camps for espionage. He was first sent to Pechora camps, where he worked from 1940 until 43, and then he was transferred to one camp in Akhtubinsk, Kazakhstan, and he was released in 1945, but wasn't allowed to move out of the place where he worked only a few years later. And then he moved to Vilnius, where he still lives until now. And he now plans, already for 2 years, he's planning to come back to Czech Republic, but we are not sure if he's going to make it. There is an interesting subgroup of those that escaped to Poland. These were like members of so-called Czechoslovak Legion in Poland. It had approximately 700 members, and most of them were interned by the Soviets when, after the defeat of Polish army, this legion tried to cross to Romania, but they were interned by the Soviets in one of the PO camps. And from this PO camp, several members of the legion, including several Jews, like Karel Gorovsky, who was a lawyer from Prague, and he was known for his anti-Bolshevik papers. He was a communist, but at the same time he wrote several papers, anti-Bolshevik papers in Prague, and for this reason he was taken to Lublanka, Butyrka, and then to Gulag camps. Very interesting group of the Czech Jews that happened to end up in Gulag camps were the survivors of the first deportation of European Jews organized by Adolf Eichmann in October 1939. There were approximately 5,000 Jews taken from Vienna, Ostrava, and Katowice to Nisko camp, and only like 500 of them remained in the camp, and the others were simply forced to cross the border to Soviet Union or to Soviet-occupied Poland, and they were hunted by like Ukrainian militia and different gangsters trying to get their money, gold, etc. But those who managed to survive the trip, like most of them settled in Lviv. Also, many of them were arrested on the way by the NKVD for illegal crossing of the border, and they were directly sent to the camps. But many of them stayed in Lviv until the May 40, when most of them were arrested and deported, along with other people, to either Gulag camps or different places where they had to work on mainly collective farms. One of the few survivors still alive is Leopold Presser, who was deported to Nisko from Katowice, where he managed to get after the occupation of Czechoslovakia, together with his family. And he was one of those like forced to cross the border to Soviet Union, and he was arrested in Lviv, taken to Gulag camps, and he was released on amnesty for Czechoslovak citizens in Soviet Union in 1942. And his father was also released, but he died a few days after arriving to the Czechoslovak unit, simply of ill health from the Gulag camps. I happened to be just a week ago in Leo Baeck Institute in New York, and I found this interesting letter from Arnold Stein, who was born in Karlovy Vary or Karlsbad in Czechoslovakia, and he was also taken to Nisko camp. He managed to get to Lviv and sent letters to his daughter, who was in England, in London, and also to his wife, who stayed in Prague. His wife died in Auschwitz. He died in a Gulag camp, but the daughter survived in London, and she donated like all the materials to Leo Baeck Institute in New York. Then I would like to focus now for a while on the easternmost region of pre-war Czechoslovakia, which was occupied by the Hungary. There were approximately 8,500 mainly young men escaped to Soviet Union because they were they had to join the Hungarian army. So they rather fled to Soviet Union, and most of them were imprisoned in Gulag camps. But also around 600 Jews from, not just from Ruthenia, but also like Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, crossed the border to the Soviet Union through this region and were arrested and sent to Gulag camps, most of them for 3 years for illegal crossing of the border, then for 5 to 8 years for espionage or other accusations. One of them was Herman Perl. These pictures that you see were collected in one of the archives in Ukraine. It took us like 3 visits and a lot of bureaucracy and communication with other Ukrainian historians that helped us to gain access to these materials and actually to scan several hundred of files on former Czechoslovak citizens that escaped to Soviet Union during the war. And Herman Perl was fleeing the Hungarian persecution in Ruthenia and crossed the border to Soviet Union in 1940 with his wife and her sister. They were first imprisoned in Skola camp, which was quite close from the Ruthenian border. And then they were sentenced, each of them, to 3 years in labor camps. Perl was transported to Kargopolak and the sisters to Siblak, but unfortunately in these files we didn't manage to find any other information connected to their case. I just had a meeting at the Holocaust Memorial Museum 2 days ago because in these NKVD materials are also hundreds or thousands of pictures of families that the refugees took with them, and they were of course taken from them during the interrogation, but are very well described with names and places where they come from. So they provide also extremely interesting source of information about the destroyed communities, especially of this eastern part of Czechoslovakia, as there are hundreds of similar pictures present in these files. We also made little surveys of not just the small portion of the files that we managed to collect, but also finding aids in these archives and concerning the group of Jewish refugees fleeing Ruthenia. Approximately 1/4 of them were members of Communist Party, or they declared they were members of Communist Party. Unfortunately, or we don't know if that was true or they just tried to pretend to be communist. In many cases, being a communist didn't help much. Very often they were given longer sentences and argumented that the Communist Party needs you back home. There is no need to run away from your duties in your own country. As these archives in Ukraine also very often include either death certificates or release papers of arrested Czechoslovak citizens of Jewish origin, we were able to track the places where most of them were taken. Most of them were taken to Vorkuta, Pechora, and Ukhta. Quite a few of them were in Norilsk and Karaganda, and a lot of them in Magadan, in Kolyma. I'm not going to speak much about the actual stay in the camps because it pretty much reflected the fate of most of the refugees or prisoners in the war times, in the war era. There are certain specifics that we are describing in our papers, like I don't know, keeping kosher in Gulag, which never ended up well, or marriage, etc. But apart from a few specifics, the situation reflected like situation of other prisoners of Gulag at that time. In those Ukrainian historians did a survey of refugees from Ruthenia already a few years ago, and from this we can assume also the mortality of the Czechoslovak Jews, or also from what we have seen in those few files or few hundred files we managed to go through. And it also again reflects the mortality of the overall situation in Gulag camps in the war era. I would like to mention the case of Mikuláš Vég, because his story was interesting for us from the point that we were approached by his brother Luděvík Vég. He also opened the exhibition we had at the Václav Havel Library. And he knew his brother got lost in Soviet Union during the war, his twin brother. And we managed to find his criminal investigation file along with the picture. And also there was a picture of both of them. So we could provide Luděvík this beautiful picture with his brother. So he got it like after 70 years back. It was one of the most touching and rewarding experiences we had during the project. There were not, as I mentioned before, there were many people trying to get to Soviet Union through this Ruthenia region and were imprisoned. This is an example of 18 Hungarian Jews who were taken by the Hungarian police to the border and driven to cross it. They were all sentenced to 3 to 5 years in Gulag camps. This is all 18 of them. And actually they were sentenced for being illegally transported across the border. And 5 of them didn't survive the camps. The driver Ferdinand Schwarz died of tuberculosis in hospital of Kargopolák. Worker and Hashomer Hatzair member Andrei Axelrod died in the same camp of cardiac arrest and physical exhaustion, as well as the tradesmen Vladislav Schwarz and Vladislav Weiss. And jewelry maker Vladislav Greenbaum died in one of the sub-camps of Uchtižemlák. That's from what we were managed to gather in these in their files. As I mentioned before, 1942 meant release for most of the Czechoslovak prisoners, and one of the first who were released were the Czech Jews, because they could declare their Czech citizenship. Unfortunately, most of the Jews that came from the occupied region of that were occupied by Hungary, they were considered as Hungarian citizens, so they were usually not freed at all. The amnesty was in order to let the prisoners to fight the Germans, and as you can see mentioned on the slide, from 2,300 Jews who served in the unit, 6 of them died in combat. And again, after their release, around 20 of them were arrested. Among them was again the unfortunate lawyer Karel Gorovsky. And because he was released, it was a mistake. They released him according to this amnesty, but then the NKVD decided that he's the guy that should stay in the camp. And so he was again taken to the camps and went through Karlák, Tagilák, and Abes camps. And he was released only in 1955. He died in a psychiatric clinic in Czechoslovakia because he was a fighter and he tried to fight for his rights and rehabilitation, etc. And they simply got rid of him and closed him in a psychiatrist clinic. He's one of the few people that managed to write and publish memoirs before the so-called Velvet Revolution in 1989, and published the memoirs in exile. Among the released was also Kurt Lanzer, we interviewed half a year ago in Israel. He was released along with other members of his family. His father, Eugen, died again like 14 days after being released, and because of exhaustion, etc. His two brothers died in the first battle of the Czechoslovak unit. So the chief of the unit granted his mother, Malvina, that he won't be sent to the front as the only surviving male member of the family, and he went through training as a paratrooper, which he later used in Israel and was awarded, as you can see, by Ben Gurion in 1949 for his bravery. Unfortunately for the Czechoslovak Jews, the imprisonment, or when they were captured by the Germans, it meant certain death. So that's also why they were recognized for their bravery in the Legion, because they knew they simply cannot afford to be captured. And one of the people who was murdered right after his capture was also the brother of the presser that I showed in a few slides before, Egon. There is an interesting book we found a year ago in National Archives in Czech Republic. It's a propaganda book which was put together in 1943 in Prague, and it's the testimonies of prisoners of war and that were brought back to Prague and were met with the Czech Protectorate press. And among them was also Karl Eger, who survived the transport to Nisko, then Pečora labor camp, and he was caught in the first battle of Sokolovo. And they quite accurately describe his fate and the fate of others who fled to Soviet Union. But they don't mention the fact that he was transported to Nisko. They just state that he escaped there on his own. And 4 of those prisoners of war had to join the Wehrmacht for propaganda reasons, but Karl Eger was murdered right after he was used for propaganda, and his brother died in one of those Pečora camps. So you can see that very often the imprisonment in the Gulag camps was just an episode in very difficult lives of many of the Czechoslovak refugees. This is just another example of a Czechoslovak Jew who came from the part that was occupied by Hungary, Schulem Friedman. And actually his father Solomon worked in New York from 1913 to 1920 in order to make money to buy a small piece of land back in Czechoslovakia. And Schulem was arrested in Lviv in November 1939 for illegal crossing of the border and sentenced to 3 years in Gulag camps. He worked as a doctor in one of the Pečora camps. And he was officially freed in 1942, but had to stay in the camp until September 1946. He was listed as a citizen of Hungary, an enemy state. Thus, the 1942 amnesty for Czechoslovak citizens didn't apply to him. Actually, the similar situation was with the Viennese Jews who were taken to Nisko and then escaped to Lviv and were sent to Gulag camps. Only less than 100 of them returned to Vienna in mid-50s or 50s, and latest in mid-50s when they were released because they were considered German citizens. Just for your knowing, we interviewed in December an interesting person who was born in this easternmost region in Czechoslovakia, and he survived the Hungarian labor camps. And in 1946, when the Ruthenia became part of Soviet Union, approximately 7,000 Jews could leave for Czechoslovakia, but somehow he didn't get the permission, so he was trying to escape to Czechoslovakia with his wife, pregnant wife, but they were caught and he was sentenced to 3 years in Uchta camps. And it's still very unclear. We managed to find a lot of documents concerning his release to Poland, and then he managed to cross the border illegally with the help of joint organization. And he took part in illegal activities of the Jewish community in Prague, mainly helping to cross the border to Austria, to Jews from Hungary and Poland mainly. And then they headed for Israel. And he was arrested with his brother Herman, who died after a few months of interrogations in the custody. And Evgen was sentenced to 7 years in the prisons in Czechoslovakia. I just added his story to show that the end of the war didn't mean the end of suffering of Holocaust survivors in the Gulag camps. I don't know what that's about it, my time. I wanted to thank you for your attention, and anyone interested in our project is very welcome to discuss it. Thank you.
We still have 10 minutes on the schedule before lunch, miraculously, and I would like to therefore open the floor to any questions or comments from our audience about any of the 3 talks that we've heard this morning. Olga Cook, please.
Directed to Sasha Etkin.
Maybe if you could stand and speak a little louder.
In your fascinating discussion of Sveshnikov, I noticed a similarity with Kirsnovskaya, and I wondered whether her настольные книги, also done in pencil drawings, but mainly with text as well. They kind of have satirical, they're cartoons and captions. Whether there was any contact or any effort on the part of Sveshnikov to have any connection with the artistic world of the Gulag, because he couldn't have been one in a vacuum. But of the artists that I have seen, those 2 have the greatest similarities in their delivery. Perhaps hers are not as grotesque as his, or as surreal, but there are many similarities.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I don't know. I should think about this particular analogy. But he seems to be a very kind of lonely person. He was not interested in, people kind of were trying to get to him. People like, of junior generation, like Sinyavsky, for instance. Sinyavsky seems to be really kind of trying to collect cases, particularly after before his incarceration. He was interested in getting this story imagined as kind of story of special kind of culture and art, story of the Gulag. That was very pioneering attempt on Sinyavsky's part. But Sveshnikov was doing just his own thing by himself.
Thank you. Harley Balzer.
Harley Balzer, a teacher at Georgetown. Sasha, this may be a stretch, but the picture, one of the first pictures you showed of the 2 men walking, the guy with the cross on his chest, the cross is a Roman cross, it's not an Orthodox cross. And if you tie that to what you said about purgatory, could that be the image, that this is purgatory, or any explanation for why it's not an Orthodox cross?
Right. Well, first, of course, it's fantasy. So in the Gulag, obviously, in the camp, there were no monks, no crosses were allowed, whatever. I mean, it's pure fantasy. If to believe, as it is claimed, that it was produced in the camp, in the, this like frozen nights, painted on the linens. This is something that was very dear and very important in that particular environment. So it's open to interpretation. The whole collection of these images and symbols is full of Catholic reminiscences, and you are perfectly right about the nature of this cross and also of the dress. And so, how to interpret it? This idea about purgatory is just one of the, just a kind of my attempt to understand it, to give some kind of, to root it in some kind of understandable experience why. But I find analogies also in literature, in Mandelstam, in Bakhtin, in some other people, Vsevolod Nekrasov, in some other people who survived more or less the same exactly, and were very interested in this Catholic imagery of hell and purgatory.
Any other questions? In the back, David Goldfrank.
I'm also faculty here, and I wanted to follow up on this purgatory question too, really, because my questioning has to do with the fact that I know that some of the white army anti-red posters during the Civil War did use modifications of the traditional Orthodox Last Judgment iconography, which also includes torture chambers in hell, where Bolsheviks are, and also indicates this, and also uses the Last Judgment iconography to indicate the suffering that's brought on allegedly by the Reds. So I'm not doubting the fact that this much, much richer apocalyptic art that the Catholics produced served as the inspiration for Sveshnikov and some of the other artists here, but I'm wondering whether there was any Soviet post-Gulag art or Gulag art which did actually make use, as the whites had earlier, of traditional Russian Last Judgment iconography.
Great question. I don't have an answer right now, but I can just testify as a witness myself that in the thaw in the late 60s, early 70s, these Russian icons were became again very popular among the intelligentsia. And say Sinyavsky with Galamstok, these two guys whom I mentioned, they organized a kind of expeditionary trip to the Russian north, to Pomoria, and to collect also old believers became very fashionable. And among that art, those very few actually icons which show the final judgment, they were reproduced and discussed very kind of energetically. But I cannot go further than that.
We have time for one more question. Alain Blum.
Alain Blum from the Russian Center in Paris. My question is to Adam Hradilek, because a very interesting presentation. My question is, well, the Jew stories in the Gulag are very interesting, especially because there is many different situations between Jews from Poland, who have been able to come back also with agreement, between Britain and Soviet Union, Jews from Czechoslovakia, and Jews from Lithuania, who has not been able to come back. My question is whether Jews from Poland have been able often to even to flee after the war in Western countries and in Israel. Many go through DP camps and so on, and have been able even to tell their story in Israel. I wonder whether there is many Czech Jews also who came out from Czechoslovakia in 48, 49, and gave their testimony in Israel, for example, or whether the story is completely different from Polish Jews.
No, I think it's going to be pretty much similar, because there are approximately 20,000 of Jews who fled to Israel, and
Many of them were interviewed by Czech scholar Erich Kulka, and now his collection is part of Yad Vashem. And there are approximately like more than 100 interviews with Czech Jews who were fighting in this unit. He was mainly focused on the Jewish resistance against the Germans, but at the same time, in most of these stories is also the Gulag episode mentioned. So it's now also part of our collection. So anyone interested, we have digitalized it. We have it in our collection.
Thank you very much. We now have a break for lunch. We will reconvene at 2 p.m. And please join me in thanking all of this morning's speakers.